Good afternoon. My name is Gordon Flake. I'm the CEO of the Perth US Asia Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you all this afternoon, at least afternoon here in Perth, to an online public event featuring Dr. Rajagopalan from the Organization Research Foundation, talking about whether or not it's time for an expanded or enhanced Quad. This is the first of these large public events that we have done not in person here at the Perth US Asia Center. And while we suffer from the lack of direct physical contact, it is nice to note that this new format allows us to expand our reach. Today, we have over 18 countries represented. In those of you who have signed on to listen to Dr. Rajagopalan speak this afternoon, I think that, one, highlights the deep respect in which our speaker is held globally, but also the importance of the topic going forward. It is the practice of the Perth US Asia Center and the University of Western Australia, at which we sit, to begin all public events with an acknowledgement of country. And that is a recognition that the land on which the university sits is traditionally the land of the Noongar people of the Whadjuk Nation, or rather the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. And that is something that's done in Australia. The fact that we've got 17 other countries listening in, I think, it might be something quite familiar to those of us here in Perth, or those who are calling in from Melbourne or Brisbane or Canberra or Sydney. But for those of you calling in from Singapore or the Netherlands or the United States, it is just basically a way in Australia that we pay our respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which we live. And that applies to my home office that I'm calling from here rather than the campus of the University of Western Australia. And we do indeed pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, it gives me great honor to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Rajeswari Rajagopalan is a distinguished fellow at the Indian-based think tank, one of the premier think tanks in India, the Organization Research Fellow. She's also the senior Asia defense writer for The Diplomat. She served for 5 years on the Indian National Security Council Secretariat. And before that, on another of India's preeminent think tanks, the Institute for Defense and Security Analysis. Those of you here in Perth know her well. She was one of our keynote speakers for our In the Zone conference 2 years ago on space, an issue of great expertise to her. And then just in February this year, she spoke at our last public symposium, which strangely, in this weird time that we live in, seems like it was 2 years ago. And that was our India, Japan, Australia Trilateral Japan Symposium. But we're delighted to have Raji join us today to talk about the Quad. The Quad is one of these groupings that has probably had more written about it than actual words have been spoken in the official meetings. But there's no keen interest anymore in the trilateral relationship between Japan, Australia, and the United States. But once you add India into that mix, it becomes something very different. And so to have one of India's preeminent security analysts think not just about the Quad, but in this current context, what about the future of the Quad might be, I think is something that we all should be interested in looking forward. And I couldn't think of anybody I'd rather hear from more. I would note that with this invitation, we sent out to all of you a copy of our most recent Indo-Pacific analysis brief. You may have seen that in the current COVID-19 environment, the pandemic environment, the Perth US Asia Center has been extremely fortunate to have join us Indo-Pacific fellows in Japan, in Vietnam, in Australia, in Indonesia, and of course in India. And Raji was the first to write a brief for us and the first to kindly agree to do one of these public lectures. And so without further ado, Raji, welcome. Thank you. Let me turn the time over to you for some initial introductory remarks. And then we'll begin a conversation with some of the questions that those online have shared with us already.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you for the very kind introduction. I'm very happy to be doing this webinar today. I'm also thrilled at the huge response that we have seen for today's webinar. Like you said, it clearly reflects the importance of the subjects that we're dealing with. It's indeed a great time to debate some of the major developments in the Indo-Pacific, especially in the strategic domain. So today's webinar is based on one of my latest publications, one of my first publications for this Perth US Asia Center, looking at the possibility of a Quad Plus arrangement. So many of you may have seen that publication already, gone through it. So given the huge response, I want to leave much of the time for Q&A and the discussion, but I'll make introductory remarks maybe for about a brief 10 minutes. I'll try and highlight about 5 points out there in the next 10 minutes. So I think the first question that comes to me is the Quad expanding? So I think the history of the Quad is very well known. A lot of people have written about it. It's one of the most often written subject in a sense on the potential of the Quad and what this Quad is to do and so on and so forth. But the Quad, of course, came about the fact that the Quad has come back for a second time. It's taken a rebirth for a second time in November 2017, a decade after the first Quad withered away in a sense, shows that the initial imperatives, the concerns, the worries that gave shape to the first time the Quad came about has not really gone. They are still very much alive. Not only they are alive, there are actually, those threats have become much more magnified, a lot more intensified over the last year or so. The strategic consequences of China's rise, its muscular policies, its aggressive military posturing, and the tendency to use force or the threat of use of force, including economic and trade coercion, these have become much more prominent in the Indo-Pacific. You cannot say that all countries are on board with the Quad or even the larger Indo-Pacific concept. There is certain amount of reluctance. A number of countries, including India, maybe New Zealand, and even possibly South Korea, sat on the fence for a long time. And sitting in New Delhi, New Zealand's apprehension doesn't come as a surprise to me. It has taken somewhat similar path to that of India in a sense. India also did have a lot of apprehension, traditionally shied away from taking a clear position between the US and China. But China, I think, sometimes makes it easy for us. So China's aggressive behavior, for instance, in the case of India, to deny India the strategic space in the Indo-Pacific, as well as in global platforms such as the Nuclear Suppliers Group, or even the aggressive behavior within the UN Security Council while dealing with India's Jammu and Kashmir issue over the last year. All of this have propelled India to shift increasingly towards partnership with the like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific. India remained uncomfortable with the Quad for a long time, primarily because of the perception that it is a containment effort at China. But India today, like many more other countries, appears to be fully invested in the Quad. And I see that other countries, like including New Zealand and even South Korea, are also recognizing the need to work with other like-minded countries and who also have similar and shared security concerns about China. This brings me to the third point about what is the necessity. Despite the reluctance that we've seen from different countries in engaging in Quad or Quad plus like arrangements, more countries are seeing it as a necessary cause because of China's behavior, the coercive trade, etc. Most countries in the region are today dependent on the trade aspects, on the economic linkages with China, and this dependence have forced, at least for a period of time, to seek some sort of accommodation, to seek some sort of a middle ground with China. But China's behavior has increasingly shaved away that middle ground, with country after country moving towards taking a clear stand along with other like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific. China's military maneuvering, especially during the pandemic, be it in South China Sea or on the eastern coast, towards Taiwan, towards Japan, all of this have antagonized more and more countries about China. The very fact that you have more countries today accepting and endorsing the concept of the Indo-Pacific is an indicator of things to come. Most recently, you had the ASEAN countries come together with their ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And I think even South Korea, for instance, there has been a gradual appreciation of the Indo-Pacific strategies, and that's a welcome sign. And I think there's an also in recognition of the increasing threat that you see from China. The necessity, I think there is also another angle. No one single country can handle China on their own. Again, that China has grown enormously over the last decade, that no single power can, maybe with the exception of the US, can handle China on its own. This has necessitated all the major Indo-Pacific powers to come together, developed a common shared understanding, shared threat perspective, and this could possibly give for more concrete strategies, be it in the air or naval domain in particular, while addressing the China challenge. But there is also difficulty in cooperating. Like I said in the beginning, there is certain amount of reluctance in certain countries, including India, which have shown certain apprehension, certain wariness in endorsing the Quad for some time to time. This reluctance within certain countries can create certain difficulties, but the fact that these countries have close bilateral security relationships as well as alliance partnerships could smooth the way for more effective and security collaboration. So the key question here is, will the Quad expand? What is it like? What is it going to be like the post-COVID world scenario? It's very difficult to predict with any certainty as to how the post-COVID world order will look like. There is no certainty that the Quad Plus will emerge even as a concrete entity after the pandemic. But I would say that it has the right ingredients for it to emerge as a feasible platform. On the other hand, it could be a group of countries, like-minded countries and democratic countries that came together to work on a precise issue like the pandemic and has withered away once that is over. But more and more, I think the Chinese behavior in the Indo-Pacific, even in the middle of the pandemic, I think these countries many more countries have shown their willingness to stay put with this effort. I would go even one step further and say, we need to engage a much larger number of countries than we have had in the Quad Plus agreement arrangement that we have seen in the recent past. In the middle of the pandemic, we have had the Quad Plus countries come together. That is the original 4 Quad countries: Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. Plus, you have had New Zealand, South Korea, and Vietnam come together. But I would say that we could possibly even go one step further and bring in other like-minded countries who are also economically capable powers who could bring much more heft to the Quad in the coming years. I would argue that, as I've done in my paper, Quad expansion makes sense for a couple of different reasons. One, like I said, the shared common security threat that emanate from China. Every one of these countries in this grouping, the Quad Plus engagement that we have seen in the recent past, have been at the receiving end of the Chinese pressure tactics in recent times. In each of them is concerned about the Chinese political and military expansions in the areas proximate to them. This itself forms an excellent baseline for a collaborative effort in relation to security among all of us, among all the Quad countries. Second, every one of these countries is also far weaker than China, necessitating again cooperation between countries, between these partners and allies. In combination, I would suggest that this pragmatic approach to addressing some of the security threats that emanate from China, but also it could give way for a much deeper security cooperation engagement on a sustained basis. But expanding the Quad is not going to be easy, and expansion brings with it a lot of different divergent concerns. There are going to be problems of burden sharing issues, but I think there is clearly a momentum that should not be ignored at this point of time. So let me stop here, and I'll be happy to, I'll look forward to the questions and comments that you may have. Thank you, Gordon, for this opportunity.
Well, thank you, Raji. That was a wonderful summary. One of the advantages of this format is also having had a chance to share the short policy brief that you wrote in advance of this. It is clear that the audience who is listening with us today has had a chance to kind of read what you've written and will benefit from that summary that you've given us. And the questions that we've received both currently and in advance give an indication of how, one, well-informed the audience is, but how specific the questions they've got. And so while I've got a lot of questions myself, I thought I might just get a sampling of some of the different perspectives from around the world with some of the key questions we've already received. The first question, which I'll share with you, comes from Miss Indrani Bagchi, I think a mutual friend of ours in Delhi. She is the senior editor of the Times of India. And she asks, what should be the priorities for cooperation by any Quad Plus formulation?
Thank you, Indrani, and I think that's a fantastic question. In fact, the Quad Plus arrangement has not really been talked about in any of the official. There have been no official formal statements coming from any of the governments. In fact, the Indian Ministry of External Affairs that came out with a statement did not even refer to the Quad. It just said a group of countries came together to talk. And one of the very few people who wrote about this is our common friend. She's one of the prominent journalists who has written about this, who are one of the few people who have written a lot about this. So thank you for that question. I think at this stage, I think it's important for the Quad Plus countries to generate agreement among the Quad countries about the threat. I think the need is for all of us to have a common same language about the acknowledgement of the threat, and have a same language about the threat perception that we all share. And I think that's an important first step. Second thing that I immediately noticed is that we haven't had a open joint statement of the Quad countries in a sense. And I think that's something that is, the time has come for the Quad countries to issue an open joint statement about the threat. We all agree, for instance, whether it is in the very recent times, about the economic coercion that China is exercising very much with Australia and with a lot of other countries in the recent times, whether it is South Korea, whether it is Japan, and other countries have gone through this. So I think it is important for the Quad countries to also call out the Chinese bad behavior. Its engagement in practices such as economic and trade coercion is not all right. And therefore, the need to Quad countries to come together, issue some statements of that kind is extremely important. Again, a second thing that I think is also to look at how China has been able to dominate the multilateral organizations. And I think that's something that should be of particular concern to us at this point of time, given the pandemic crisis that we are dealing with, and how the World Health Organization was dominated by the Chinese narrative and the Chinese thinking in that sense, and how a lot of the cover-up was facilitated by the WHO in that sense. That's done a lot of harm to the whole world practically. So China has to be brought accountable, has to be made accountable. And I think the Quad countries need to take a coordinated position, a joint statement of the kinds that need to happen. I would also say that even institutions, multilateral institutions, so-called multilateral institutions that China has come about, like the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, even within these organizations, China should not be allowed to get away with a lot of such kind of domineering behavior. Such kind of somewhat destructive behavior of that kind. Again, the Quad countries do have an opportunity to coordinate their positions, come out with joint statements, call out on China when they openly flout rules and so on and so forth. So I think there are opportunities of this kind which are important. These are to be done at the open level. But I think at an informal level, behind the doors, in a sense, I think, again, there are a lot of things that we should be doing, the Quad countries doing, more at an informal level. There needs to be efforts at controlling the multilateral organization. These cannot be, again, some things can be done at an official formal level, but I think there are also things that can be done behind the scene among the Quad countries in a way to coordinate our efforts.
Well, thank you.
But I think at a much later stage, you need to also start thinking about certain amount of burden sharing, joint and coordinated patrolling. And for instance, US and Australia came out jointly. Their naval ships were out in support of Malaysia and other countries. So we need to come out with those kind of missions in the future. But I think that may be some way off, I would think.
Well, your last comments, and particularly your focus on the tension between formal and informal, is a perfect segue to the second question here. And this is from Professor Ian Hall, who's the Deputy Director of the Griffith Asia Institute, one of our counterparts over on the other side of Australia in Brisbane. He asked, is it time for the Quad to move from being a mini-lateral dialogue to becoming more of a formal arrangement and institution?
Thank you, Ian, for that question. That's a terrific question to look at, whether it's time for us to move from a multilateral kind of setup to more formalized institutional process. I would think at the very least, we need to start talking along those lines. It's time that we start addressing the more formalized way of engaging among the Quad countries. But I think I would also argue that it is more important. Institutionalization of this is important, but I think the more important aspect is to see how the Quad countries can structure their collaboration, cooperative engagements in a much more coordinated fashion. That needs to come about. So far, we have taken a certain limited stand on certain issues and limited statements by individual countries of the Quad countries, but we haven't even reached the stage of a Quad joint statement on important issues, calling out Chinese behavior. Some of those statements need to come. So I would think that more active, structured collaboration may be needed before we should even think about institutionalization process. And one of the areas I actually think which is pretty easy to do, and this has been done in the context of non-traditional security threats, particularly anti-piracy issues, is to have coordinated intelligence sharing, military and intelligence sharing on a real-time basis. And this has been done by countries like France, countries like Australia, India. We have been part of multiple collaborative engagements of that kind. But I think intelligence levels to generate greater situational awareness about the Chinese military operations and engagements in the Indo-Pacific, I think that's extremely important. For instance, Australia can look at certain areas within the Indo-Pacific on Chinese military activities, military operations, and so on and so forth. As soon as they cross certain waters and enters the Indian Ocean, for instance, that information must be shared with India and the US, and India and the US can take the lead in kind of tracking and monitoring the Chinese behavior, the Chinese military operations, and so on and so forth. So I think the need for such kind of intelligence and military operational information sharing, I think it's something that can be done in a much more easier fashion. This has been done for anti-piracy operations. So there exists the basic structure for such kind of collaboration. It's just that the Quad countries need to come together, start having those structured, planned conversations around these important subjects. So institutionalization is absolutely important, and maybe at a later stage, because Quad right now, it's just a number. There are 4 countries involved, and therefore it is a Quad. Maybe at a later date, we can come up with a new organization, a new institution can be framed involving the current Quad, but also the Quad plus countries. That can form the basis, but we could have a new name. And I think that could be an effective way of dealing with a lot of the challenges that we see in the Indo-Pacific.
Fantastic. Allow me to interject a question of my own on here, both in your initial remarks, in your response to the last 2 questions, and in the article you wrote for us. You've been extremely articulate and passionate in your advocacy, not just for the Quad itself, but for the broader construct of the Indo-Pacific and the notion that the Quad has a broader role even beyond its current formulation. The question is, how representative are you in Delhi today? Do your recommendations and the passion you put into this articulation represent the current Modi government? Do they represent a growing consensus within India itself? Help us understand that dynamic, because really without India's leadership in this regard, I don't think much of it's likely to actually happen.
Thank you, Gordon. I think that's a terrific question to look at, because I think India's role, like you say, is important in shaping the dynamics in the region and the future of the Quad and Quad plus engagements. I think the way I see it is that Modi government has been a lot more pragmatic about when it comes to national security missions and national security objectives. There's a lot more pragmatism. There's a realistic and national security oriented approach to dealing with a number of different countries. I think we have seen a lot more clarity in the foreign policy and on the broader strategic objectives of India. And if you look at the Indian foreign policy since the Modi government came into office, I think we are increasingly aligning with the US allies. And that's also the increasingly the major Indo-Pacific powers. They are also the democratic countries of the region. So there is greater alignment of thinking between think tankers like me and the government, I would think, at this point of time. There are pockets of resistance to these kind of formulations. I wouldn't say that everybody is on board. But I think by and large, within the bureaucracy and the political establishment, for sure, there is a greater appreciation of what China threat means and what are the various options, so strategic options for India to deal with to address the China challenge. And India on its own cannot deal with it for a number of different reasons. Of course, there will be differentiated response to how India deals with China and to how the US deals with China. But I think at the end of the day, the capacity deficit on the part of India in terms of hard power capabilities makes a strong case. And I think that's been made repeatedly within the country as well in how we need to engage in a diplomatic maneuvering so that we have a set of countries that we can rely on, in managing China. Nobody is talking about containing China because I think that's, I went through some of the questions that we already got. Many see that this is an effort to contain China. There might be elements of that, but I think containment of China is something that's gone by a long time ago. We are trying to see how do we ensure that China is managed well so that it contributes to the Indo-Pacific, the prosperity and the well-being of the Indo-Pacific region. For India, I think that the tools that it uses are that diplomatic maneuvering is important, and therefore we have reached out to the Quad, that the Quad has come back for the second term. The Quad, I think it shows progress, that the fact that the Quad has been upgraded to a foreign ministerial level, again, demonstrates the Indian government's commitment and the progress of the Quad within the Indian thinking as well.
Oh, thank you. Now, you've already started to address the China question a little bit. It's funny, in 30 years of working on the region, for the bulk of that time, when we talked about the elephant in the room in the US, we were always talking about China. Yeah. And as we've now moved from talking about Asia Pacific to Indo-Pacific, and India has become increasingly central to our discussion, it seems strangely inappropriate to say that China is the elephant in the room when clearly India is the elephant, right? And so China has got to go back to a different moniker, maybe the dragon in the room. But one way or the other, you already began to address, in your response to that last question, the role of China. In your initial remarks, you said, well, China makes it easy, right? As hard as this might be. One of our listeners, Professor Mark Beeson, here at University of Western Australia, asked kind of point blank, why don't we just invite China to join the Quad?
That's an interesting question, given that the Quad is all about China. No, I think there is merit to engaging China, and we engage China. All the Quad countries engage China in multitude of platforms, whether it is ASEAN and ARF, and the number of platforms, initiatives at the regional level, at the global level are far too many for us to think that China is being isolated and so on and so forth. But here I would say that the primary purpose of the Quad is to coordinate our responses, our action against China. So when the whole effort is to counter China's aggressive posturing and so on and so forth, I think that it becomes difficult to see how China can be brought into the Quad itself. There are institutionalists who have made this argument that China should be brought into certain institutions to mend Chinese behavior, to include China, to integrate China into the framework so that you can moderate the Chinese behavior. That's been an argument that's been made well for a long time. But again, you have seen, and this has been the effort for the last 2 or 3 decades by the Western countries, by the US, where we have made efforts to engage China, China part of every single institution that you can think of. And yet it has not paid much dividend. In fact, on the contrary, China has gone into certain institutions. Every country will work to pursue their own national interests. But the way China has gone about, I think that's been far more destructive to the ASEAN, for instance. Look, ASEAN is the best example. The ASEAN unity, which has been talked about, has been so lost because of a lot because of China. Even other institutions, I can say the same thing. And how China gets into various institutions, various initiatives of these kinds, and tries to create divisions and ends up creating a sort of divided house. And ASEAN is the best example. ASEAN has been generally seen as the good example of how unified, how well integrated, at least in economic terms, they have been able to do so very successfully. But when it came to a lot of the sovereignty and territorial issues, it has clearly shown how divisive China has been in terms of having a fractured ASEAN today. So having China within the Quad, I'm not entirely convinced, because the whole effort is to manage and contain or come up with appropriate responses to manage the rise of China is the center of the central argument of the Quad. So it's very difficult to see how we can embrace China within the Quad. But it's an important aspect to look at.
Well, thank you, Raji. You have a wonderful ability to make us look good, and it seems to be, you almost make it seem like we've practiced this, in that you anticipate and provide a perfect segue to the next question. Our next question comes from Singapore, from Ms. Nazia Hussain, who's a senior analyst at the Rajaratnam School for International Studies, and she says, will the Quad potentially expand to include ASEAN, particularly after the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific?
Thank you, Nazia, for that question. That's, again, it falls beautifully from the previous response that I was talking about, where I was mentioning the role of ASEAN and so on and so forth. ASEAN, I think it's, in a sense, when you look at the Quad plus countries that are being engaged today, we already have a bit of ASEAN there with Vietnam's participation. We already see the ASEAN participation there. ASEAN itself may not become part of the Quad. The way ASEAN has been divided a house, I don't see ASEAN as an institution becoming part of the Quad. There are certain countries within the ASEAN community who remain extremely, for lack of a better word, loyal to China. So in a sense, getting those countries on board will be a problem, I would think. But I think I can certainly see some of the major ASEAN countries, in Singapore, for instance, or even Indonesia, which has actually taken the lead in writing the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And I think, again, China helps us to do certain things, and it helps us move in a certain directions much faster than we would have anticipated. Indonesia has not been very keen to endorse the Indo-Pacific, or the ASEAN in general has not been very happy to kind of endorse for quite some time. There have been apprehensions within the ASEAN about endorsing this Indo-Pacific concept also, because it's again seen as having a very strong China element. But the fact is that, again, in the last few weeks, China's entry into the Indonesia's exclusive economic zone into the Natuna Islands, again, have made things a lot more difficult and challenging for Indonesia. And I would, again, thinking of the Vietnamese fishing vessel a few days ago. So there have been increasing number of instances that the ASEAN countries themselves have faced that actually makes it a lot of these ASEAN countries to come together, become possibly part of the Quad plus, and so on and so forth. So right now, we have an ASEAN member, and Vietnam is also important because it's also the current chairman of the ASEAN. They are already part of the Quad plus engagements that we have today. But in future, I can certainly see Singapore and countries like Indonesia becoming part of the Quad plus, and they should be able to, again, collaborate and contribute effectively to the Quad plus engagement that we see for the future.
So just to be clear, again, both from your article and from the discussion thus far, it seems to me that the core of what you're saying is the Quad itself needs to be strengthened. It needs to be more vibrant. It needs to be more real. And then as the Quad itself becomes more real, it needs to think proactively about other parties that it can engage with. So an enhanced Quad, right? And it doesn't necessarily, we're not necessarily talking about membership. We're not, because obviously, once you add one more member, it ceases to be the Quad. It becomes the Quint and whatever the thing beyond that is. But it's really not a matter of ASEAN joining it. It's a matter of how does the Quad together work with ASEAN? How do they work with with other parties. Is that a fair assessment of the core of your argument?
So absolutely, I think that are absolutely, you're right about it and how we engage ASEAN. But ASEAN itself as an institution, I'm not sure will get on board with the Quad Plus engagements agenda that we might have, because a lot of it is driven towards China, towards managing China problem. And we don't have a unified house when it comes to ASEAN that can speak with a single voice about the China threat we face. And therefore, and that's why my emphasis on how some of the major ASEAN countries would become active participants of the Quad Plus engagements of the future, but not ASEAN as a whole. We will still continue to engage ASEAN, but I don't think ASEAN itself as a whole would be able to get adapted into the Quad itself.
One of our participants today, Professor Yi Sang-hyun, who's a senior research fellow at the Sejong Institute in South Korea, asked the question, how do Quad nations view South Korea's position in the Indo-Pacific? You've talked about that a little bit. I'd like to take that question and expand it a little bit. If indeed the core of your vision is that the Quad is strengthened and better institutionalized, and it's looking for natural partners, you've already talked at some length about ASEAN. Is South Korea a natural partner that the Quad would be looking to work with? Is France? Is the UK?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about the other partners that would really represent an enhanced Quad or a Quad Plus, or a low-hanging fruit of priorities for the Quad to engage with?
Absolutely fantastic question. I think South Korea has remained an important partner bilaterally with India, but also with all of the Quad countries. It has been an important. There have been occasional troubles in the relationship between, whether it is between South Korea and the US or South Korea and Japan. We have seen some ups and downs, but I think those are temporary in one sense. But I think broader point is that even as South Korea remains a US ally, it has had a very close economic relationship with China. And that has made it difficult for South Korea to come out with open statements endorsing the Indo-Pacific for a very long time. But I think even 2 years ago, when President Trump was in Seoul, again, whether South Korea was willing to openly endorse, that was still question marks about it. But I think eventually South Korea has come on board. But I think, again, that has been facilitated by China. China's use of economic and trade sanctions or trade coercion on South Korea after the deployment of the US missile defense, the THAAD missile defense system, was an important push factor. Thereafter, I think President Moon Jae-in also has come out with a new Southern policy, which also looks at diversifying its diplomatic partnerships, engagements with other Indo-Pacific countries, like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific region. So I think there has been a greater appreciation in the backdrop of the Chinese economic coercion, especially after the THAAD deployment and so on and so forth. So even South Korea, that has had initial difficulties in endorsing the Indo-Pacific concept, has got on board with the Indo-Pacific concept, and now it's obviously gone several steps ahead to even become part of the Quad Plus engagements. As for other countries that India and the other Quad countries should engage with, I think there are several other important partners. France is an important partner in this regard. France's critical presence in the Western Indian Ocean, again, makes it a very attractive option for all of us to have France within the Quad Plus engagements. I'm sure that France will be more than happy to be part of such an engagement, strategic engagements with the Quad Plus countries. Another country that comes to mind is Canada. Canada has remained, again, has very strong security concerns about China and what kind of threat that China poses to its security, its broader economic engagements, economic interests, and so on and so forth. So UK, I would, yes and no. There are certain times the kind of developments that you see within the UK does not give me a lot of hope and assurance that UK is going to is going to be willing to play as an effective Quad member. Certain policy decisions taken by the UK government from time to time are not particularly reassuring to India or many of the other countries of the Quad. I am again not exactly very certain of the threat perception that UK has, and that it is that it shares the same security concerns, threat perceptions with the Quad countries. So I'm not entirely sure of the UK, but I would clearly vote for France and Canada. These are also, Canada certainly is a much more, also brings in the economic muscle power in that sense, because we also need economically capable powers to come in, so that we are able to provide a lot of alternatives, options for countries, smaller countries in the Indo-Pacific region.
Let me throw one other country on that list and just get your reaction to that, and that is New Zealand. Australia's close partner in almost every regional initiative that you can think of for the last 30 years. How do you see New Zealand's reaction to the Quad and potential working together with them?
Absolutely. New Zealand, sorry, I did not talk specifically about New Zealand because they're already part of the Quad Plus engagement that we have seen in recent times. But clearly, New Zealand is an important player in the Indo-Pacific conversations, strategic engagements. And the fact that, New Zealand has had a very similar strategic path when it comes to endorsing these concepts, these new concepts of the Indo-Pacific and so on and so forth. Until very recently, New Zealand did not even endorse the Indo-Pacific concept. They continue to use the old formulation of Asia-Pacific rather than the Indo-Pacific as a strategic coinage. So there have been certain difficulties on the part of the on part of the New Zealand government to endorse the Indo-Pacific concept, given the extremely sensitive economic linkages that, and so therefore I'm saying these are very understandable as to why some countries remain skeptical of endorsing the Indo-Pacific concept or the Quad and so on and so forth. But again, China has made it somewhat easy for us. China's push into the Pacific Islands, South Pacific Islands, again, has been something very, very sensitive. And of course, the use of economic coercion by China to a lot of countries, including New Zealand and of course Australia now is bearing the brunt. So these are becoming important imperatives for countries like even New Zealand to become part of it. So New Zealand has gone from not endorsing the Indo-Pacific concept until very recently to actually becoming part of the Quad Plus engagement that we are on in the last two months, in a sense. So we have South Korea, we have Vietnam, we have New Zealand as the three other countries, in addition to the Quad countries that have been engaged in the recent efforts. They may have come together primarily in addressing the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, which again, China is responsible for the kind of lack of information or the disinformation, misinformation efforts on the part of China. But again, that collaboration is is somewhat limited, but I think that can give way for much larger and deeper engagements in the future, including with New Zealand.
Well, thank you. And to be fair to our partners in New Zealand, it's easy to have a two-ocean strategy and an Indo-Pacific strategy when you're sitting here in Perth on Australia's Indian Ocean capital, where New Zealand is set squarely in the Pacific. I would note that after 25 years in Washington, D.C., I assumed that Australia and New Zealand were right next to each other, but we in Perth are actually closer to Hong Kong than we are to Auckland, right. And we're closer to Chennai than we are to Auckland. So it's a different perspective. And that actually highlights, I think, the leadership that has changed, that has taken place in a very proactive way, despite that geography. Another question, which is quite remarkable that we've gone almost 45 minutes, and probably to the relief of our audience, we've yet to use the term COVID-19. But appropriately, we've got Ms. Sana Hashmi, who's a visiting fellow at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Taipei, Taiwan. Taiwan has been very proactive in its response to COVID-19. In fact, arguably has one of the best national responses yet. And her question is, can the Quad countries come up with a joint effort to combat COVID-19?
Thank you, Sana. It's really good to hear from you, and good question whether the Quad countries can come together in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. I think the collaboration or the cooperation between among the Quad countries at this stage appears to be limited, because at best, I think in terms of is finding and identifying the best practices that can be followed. But again, it's going to be very different. For instance, because this is not just a health problem, this is also a social problem. There are the kind of democracies, the kind of countries, the government structures that we have will determine the kind of responses that we have. For instance, the US is one of the more advanced democratic countries. It has a very different set of practice when it comes to dealing with the COVID-19 situation than India. India is the largest democracy, but we have a very different approach. We have been able to come up with very harsh lockdown, for instance, which is not something that a country like the US would do. So I think finding a cooperative mechanism among the Quad countries is going to be limited. It's going to be difficult. Right now, I think everybody is going to be focused on their national approaches in how best to address the issue from their national perspective. But I think there are broader conversations that have obviously been happening for the last few weeks now. And the broader cooperation is in terms of developing a vaccine, repatriation of the your nationals who may be stranded in third countries, and so on and so forth. So I think, but given that you are sitting in Taiwan, I think that's something that we need to kind of engage. The Quad possibly can actually engage with Taiwan to understand, because Taiwan is a perfect democracy, and it hasn't had a lockdown, yet it has managed the pandemic and situated so close to China, yet it has had one of the lowest number of infections as well as casualties. So there is something to learn from Taiwan in case of in as to how best to address such kind of situations. But otherwise, I wouldn't think there are immediately there are areas of cooperation in targeting or in addressing the COVID-19 in an effective manner among the Quad countries. I think there are examples that we can learn from each other, best practices we can share with each other. But in terms of identifying important, immediate, pragmatic areas of collaboration, in that sense, is going to be somewhat limited.
If I can move now into the realm of the more speculative, we obviously don't know yet how the COVID-19 pandemic plays out. And there's been an awful lot of initial thought in terms of how it changes geopolitics, how it changes alliances, how it changes relative balance of power in the region. And again, a lot of that remains in the realm of speculation. At the same time, however, both the Indo-Pacific, which you have referred to quite a lot, and the Quad, in some respects, seem to rest on a couple of basic presumptions. You know, we have viewed that institutionally at the Perth US Asia Center in a narrative that says that the economic center of gravity in our region has been shifting for 25 years. You know, 25 years ago or 35 years ago, it was clearly in Northeast Asia with Japan and Korea. And over the last 25 years, as China has grown, it has shifted gradually southwest. And if things go the way we hoped, right, with the continued growth of ASEAN as a whole, Indonesia in particular, and particularly the growth of India, that economic center of gravity would continue to track southwest. And hence the Indo-Pacific was already a fait accompli. It was a structure that prepared us better for the future. But it relied on India's continued emergence, and to an important but lesser degree, Indonesia and broader ASEAN's continued emergence. In the same way, you know, without India, there's no Quad. Just like without India, there's no Indo-Pacific. So I guess the question I'm asking is, and again, this is where we're getting to speculation. Having seen your government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic thus far, do you see cause for concern for a shift in trajectory, or do you remain confident that India will continue to grow and emerge, and that shifting geoeconomic, geostrategic shift, which has led to the Indo-Pacific discussion and the Quad discussion, will continue despite setbacks?
That's important as well as intriguing set of questions to deal with, issues to kind of deal with in a sense. Of course, I think the national lockdown and the self-isolation kind of methods that have been adopted so far by the Indian government in dealing with the pandemic has had important implications for the economy. The fact that none of your businesses are functioning, the economy is practically shut in a sense. So there is no movement of goods across the country. There have been massive restrictions, which one hopes that is going to be relaxed post May 3rd. So there have been severe economic costs to India's approach to the pandemic crisis. But India believed that we did not have much of a choice than to have a complete lockdown and stay at home kind of an approach to dealing with this crisis, given the lack of public health infrastructure, adequate amount of public health infrastructure. So this has been part of the problem as to why India has to do it. The government clearly acknowledges and understands the economic cost of the COVID-19 response. It's a response. How well will India come out of this? I think that's $1 million question, but I think it's going to be the growth rates are going to be coming down, are going to plummet down. There are going to be severe economic costs so the projections are already kind of, we are not into negative growth, but we might be going down that path, which will also determine the economic growth of the state is also going to determine how well it's going to be able to position itself as a political and strategic entity in a sense. And so it's important that India comes out of this in a decent fashion. China so far has not remained much, has not been affected too badly. But I would think there could be repercussions on China as well if the rest of the world does not do well. If we don't do well, China is not going to be able to do well as well. So there is going to be an economic repercussion felt across the Indo-Pacific. But India's emergence from the pandemic without being badly affected is important for it to continue playing that role that you see for both in the Indo-Pacific context, but also in the larger Quad for the Quad to sustain Quad plus engagements to happen. It's going to be a tough challenge. It's going to be very difficult to say what might be the exact or precise trajectory that we can kind of see at this point of time. It's going to be a few months before you can actually see in real how the economic effect is going to be spread, how widespread the economic impact is going to be within the country. Because I think if you look at it, for instance, I'll just give you one instance: India's defense budget. India's defense budget in the last few years has already been the lowest since the 1962 India-China border war. And this has been a major complaint because this has had, again, important implications for India's military modernization. And this has been talked about by the senior military officials. Indian Vice Chief of Army Staff made several statements in the parliament. So there have been problems already. And now low economic growth rate or severe economic impact would also mean that lower defense budget allocation, that could further affect India's ability to develop the hard power capabilities that are so required for India to play an effective role in the Indo-Pacific and as a effective Quad player. So I think the impact is going to be severe. But I think it's very speculative, like you said. It's going to be completely speculative for me to say how exactly this would pan out. It's going to be a few months before we can get a better sense of how badly we are affected and how badly it's going to affect our strategic and political positioning in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, let me add to that difficult speculative question with something that's probably even more difficult and speculative. You've already given us some insights on your home country of India, but the other three countries in the Quad are also being impacted. So you have Australia facing, again, a remarkable government response to the crisis, and yet severe economic headwinds, which threatened to put us into a recession for the first time in 30 years, right? You have Japan, which has had to cancel the Olympics, some real questions around the longevity of Abe's leadership. And the United States, we can spend an entire hour on the United States. There is some question as to how much the Quad, the Indo-Pacific, and everything else relies upon some some return to normalcy in the U.S. So could you just give us your assessment, having again made a really impassioned pitch for the Quad, for not just the Quad but the Quad Plus? Can you just walk us through those other three, legs of the four-legged stool of the Quad itself, and how you see our participation in Australia, Japan, and the U.S.?
No, I think again, like you actually brought out very clearly how difficult the situation has been for all the three other countries, as well as the Quad countries, has been in addressing the pandemic, and how this is going to impact the overall capability mix of these countries in terms of the hard power capabilities that are required, and so on and so forth. And I think that's where the difference that comes from, comes into play. For instance, the kind of government, the authoritarian government that there's there in China, is able to manage some of these difficulties in a much more, in a democracy, you are held accountable. There are going to be questions asked if you're going to spend certain amount of money on your military power when you have serious health crises and so on and so forth. But those are the kind of issues that countries like China don't have to deal with. But that doesn't mean that China is going to come out completely unaffected from the current crisis. So even China is going to be badly affected from this crisis, which means that we all of us, all the Quad countries plus China, which is the main problem that we are talking about here, we all are in the same boat in many ways. So I think that's also been part of the Quad plus telephonic conversations that have been going on, for the conference that have been going on in the recent times, in the last few weeks now. One is to see how can you come out of this crisis, how the global economy can come out of the crisis without being badly affected. So again, I think there are ways in which we need to be somewhat more innovative, and try and see if the Quad countries and the Quad plus countries plus other like-minded countries can come together in engaging in economic terms, beneficial to each other than benefiting China, for instance. And I think you are already seeing a lot of the economic FDI, for instance, pulled out of China in reaction to China's recent behavior with regard to the pandemic. So I think there will need to be a lot many more conscious decisions taken by Quad plus, and other like-minded countries in engaging in economic activities that are going to be actually beneficial to each other, each of us, than benefiting China, than actually sending money to Chinese pockets. And I think that's something that's not been easy. That's not been something that we have been used to doing. We have been used to that China dependency so much. Much of the world has been relying on China in economic terms, but we have had those difficulties when it came to political and strategic issues. But I think there has to be a conscious shift being made to move away from China, so that our economic activities that we engage in do not benefit China, but we try and engage in a way that is beneficial to each of us than China. So I think that's not going to be easy transition from moving away from China to engaging each of us, because it's not been the practice for the last 2 decades, 3 decades. So it's not an easy thing, but I think these are important conscious decisions that we need to make with regard to. And I think, for instance, the other aspect suddenly comes to mind is China has been trying to also buy distressed sale, for instance, trying to get into other countries, making investments. Most recently, China did try to make inroads into one of the private sector banks in India, the HDFC. Banks, which has a fair amount of presence at the national level. But we also recognize the pitfalls of that, and that needed to be stopped. So India immediately came out with amending the FDI policy, so that we are not allowed to take money from countries with whom we share land borders and so on and so forth. So that was a much more explicit change of policy that India came out with. Following that. So there are going to be those kind of economic decisions that China is going to make, trying to push its economic inroads, making serious economic inroads into each of the Quad countries that may be going through some economically downtimes. So, but I think we need to be conscious. We need to be proactive in stopping those kind of Chinese actions in a sense. Otherwise, we will end up being so very economically dependent on China, which is a vulnerability in the longer term.
Well, Raji, if you are even only slightly representative of the broad thinking among the national security community, the strategic affairs community in India, I think the future is bright despite the current difficulties that we're facing. It is obviously, as I said from the outset, that, without India, there is no Indo-Pacific. Without India, there's no Quad. And to have your strategic thinking, not only in writing, but shared with us for the last hour, is something we benefit tremendously from. I will note that the one of the drawbacks of Zoom, and maybe it's something they can add in future functionality, is a little button that I can just push. And based on the number of people who are watching online, I think we're over 200 at this point, you can push that button and then we'll get correspondingly loud applause, because your remarks certainly deserve the applause. Thank you for your time and for your insights. For all of you who have joined in for the last hour, I hope you have learned as much as I have. As is often the case, in fact, I would probably say always the case when we do these meetings, I could have just had a wonderful hour-long phone conversation with Raji, but what I wouldn't have gotten were the excellent questions, in this case, that came from all around the world that made this such an informative discussion. So on behalf of all of us here at the Perth US Asia Center, Raji, I thank you. I thank you for your insights and your expertise. I thank all of you for listening. Please keep in touch with the center. We've got a number of public events scheduled coming up, as well as a steady stream of research that you'll be seeing in our bi-weekly e-newsletters, as well as available online. So on behalf of the Perth US Asia Center, once again, thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Raji.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you for this fantastic opportunity. I really enjoyed talking about the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. And it's been an enormous opportunity to engage with even a larger community who have been part of our audience. So thank you all, and thank you, Gordon, once again.
Indeed.